Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to this week's edition of We Shot the Cine. My name is Jeffrey Sipe. I'm here with my colleague, Nina Rodriguez. And today we're talking with Bea Aronson.
Andrea Martinez.
Andrea Martinez, excuse me. What was the order of those names? That's what I was thinking. So
hopefully you will. Talk to Bea.
Bueno, sí, Un Shot de Cine es un programa donde estamos hablando cada semana un poco de cómo se hace el cine mexicano contemporáneo, y entonces quería empezar un poco con ubicar tu carrera en ello, para ver si nos puedes contar, porque tú realmente comenzaste a hacer cine en una época muy reciente, por cierto, pero cuando no se hacía tanto cine aún, y yo creo que fuiste una de las primeras que comenzaron a poner la base de, pues no, la nueva ola, pero como que de una nueva época del cine mexicano que ahorita ya está como en su auge. Y cosa que creo que es muy admirable, y también por como ver un poco cómo has desarrollado tu carrera desde entonces, o tu historia, tus películas, porque yo creo que los has mantenido como muy personales, que bueno, tu primera película fue una película con muchos actores, que estuve en lo del cine, que en aquel entonces era más difícil aunque ahorita, que fue producido por Tequila Gang, y después hiciste un documental muy personal de tu papá, y bueno, ahora esta película, entonces no sé si nos puedes contar un poco de cómo comenzaste tú y qué ha cambiado desde entonces para ti y desde tu punto de vista en general.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias por esa introducción. Definitivamente, considero que, o sea, realmente antes de mí ha habido tantos cineastas y tantas mujeres cineastas que hay que reconocerlas. Lo que sí es que sí, o sea, me he podido mantener, y eso de repente es difícil, ¿no? Porque uno hace una primera película y luego puede hacer una segunda película y de repente ya ¿no? Ahí queda. Mi carrera ha sido un poco curiosa porque de alguna manera estoy como yendo a la inversa de muchas otras personas, que muchas veces uno va como creciendo en tamaño y en proyección, y yo como que me he ido como más íntimo. O sea, mi primera película fue producida por Guillermo del Toro y Berta Navarro. Sí tenía a Bárbara Moria, Paulina Gaitán, Fernando Luján. O sea, sí era una película bastante grande por ser una ópera prima. Y bueno, le tengo mucho cariño a esa película, aunque casi nadie la vio porque, hablando de pandemias, pues esa se estrenó justo con la influenza del 2009. Entonces, después de 2 meses en cartelera, se cerraron los cines, y bueno, ahí fue un poco como una triste historia de que, pues ahí se quedó. Pero sí, realmente fue mi película más grande. Y desde entonces, lo que me he dedicado a hacer es hacerlas más chiquitas, más chiquitas, más chiquitas, más chiquitas. No tanto por la falta de recursos, porque a final de cuentas, considero que dentro de todo me siento muy afortunada de que he podido seguir haciendo cine, y sí hemos podido acceder a los fondos estatales y privados, y del estímulo fiscal y todo eso, pero más bien es como por encontrar mi voz y por encontrar la manera que quiero contar las historias. A mí lo que me interesa, sí, mis películas se han ido yendo como a puntos más y más y más personales. Un poco como mi enfoque es como tratar sí empiezo desde lo muy personal, pero obviamente tratando de hacerlo universal, para que tenga un público, para que la gente se pueda relacionar con mi cine. Entonces, Cosas Insignificantes, pues fue un guión que, si bien tenía elementos personales, ha sido como la película menos personal. O sea, después, como tú comentas, después de esa, hice Ciclo, que trataba de un viaje que mi papá hizo con su hermano de México a Canadá en 1956. Es un documental. Me encanta trabajar tanto el documental como la ficción, y los trabajo de una manera muy similar a los dos. Y es un documental muy íntimo. Más allá de la aventura, del viaje en bicicleta, realmente lo que pretende hacer es como un poco, pues, burgar en la vida de estos dos hermanos y ver lo que pasó en esos 53 años, y es como una reflexión acerca del paso del tiempo y la familia y los sueños, la edad, a los ciclos de la vida. Y luego pues, viene Observar las aves, que sí parte de un lugar sumamente personal, porque, trata de una mujer con Alzheimer. Mi mamá tuvo Alzheimer, fue un proceso que yo viví muy, muy, muy de cerca. Pero no solamente eso, o sea, no solamente es como el tema de la película, sino que la película nace de un miedo mío. yo estaba aterrada de que me iba a dar Alzheimer y entonces de ese miedo me puse a escribir una historia y entonces esta historia salió como observar las aves. Entonces, pues sí, o sea, y luego acabo de filmar una película, bueno, no acabo de, pero mi última película, Crowther, también es una historia muy personal mía acerca de una pérdida. Entonces, es el tipo de cine que me interesa explorar, es como, pues sí, o hurgar en esos dolores, en esas complejidades que somos y pues plasmarlo en una historia que pueda tocar el corazón de cualquiera.
Creo que ya contestaste todas mis preguntas. Porque sí, justamente en observar las aves, como dijiste que estás como muy en casa tanto en el documental como en ficción, y observar las aves es una especie como de híbrido, ¿no? Entre esos dos géneros o entre muchos géneros.
Totalmente.
Y tú, en la que tú como cineasta también eres, bueno, es una película dentro de la película y tú eres la cineasta de la película dentro de la película, mientras que eres la cineasta también de la película.
Claro, sí, es como muy autorreferenciada la película y sí, me gusta jugar un poco como con el metalenguaje del cine. Entonces, en Ciclo me pasó una cosa que en este documental que hice, me pasó una cosa que yo no quería formar parte de la historia. Yo decía, se trata de mi papá y mi tío y yo estoy detrás de la cámara, yo soy la directora y tan, tan. Y descubrí en el proceso de hacer la película que yo formaba parte de esa historia. O sea, no podía no estar en la historia, porque todo el tiempo me estaban referenciando mi papá y mi tío. O sea, cuando yo les entrevistaba, yo platicaba con ellos, me decía mi papá, pues es que tu mamá. Entonces no había manera de que la directora detrás de cámaras no estuviera presente, aunque no estuviera detrás de la cámara. Entonces fue un proceso como descubrir mi lugar en esa película y a final de cuentas decidí poner una voz en off, una voz narrativa mía que no la concebí así. O sea, desde un principio yo decía, no quiero tener una voz en off y luego dije, no, sí, mi voz tiene que estar. Entonces, de alguna manera, desde Ciclo yo ya estaba presente en mis propias películas. En Ciclo casi no aparezco. O sea, aparezco en una escena de fiesta y mi voz. Pero sí se siente la presencia de la directora. Y en este caso, pues juego con ello. O sea, yo interpreto a la directora de documentales que le está ayudando a Lena a hacer su película. Casi todo el tiempo estoy detrás de cámaras. Quería jugar mucho con ese espacio detrás de la cámara que sigue existiendo para el espectador. Entonces se escucha mi voz, ella está hablando conmigo, de repente se ven como sombras o reflejos o ese tipo de cosas. Y poco a poco me voy pasando al otro lado de la cámara. Y nuevamente digo, no para adelantarme demasiado, pero en la última película que hice ya actúo en la película. Entonces también ha sido como un proceso de descubrirme dentro de mi propio cine y como explorarlo. También soy alguien que me gusta mucho los retos y me gusta como echarme clavados en los lugares más incómodos. Entonces me divierto mucho, o sea, me divierto mucho como poniéndome en ese lugar de incomodidad y de no saber si lo puedo lograr o no. Pero fue un proceso increíble hacer esto en observar las aves. Estaba aterrada, eso sí, aterradísima, pero fue padrísimo. Y bueno, obviamente también trabajar con Bea Aronson, que hizo un trabajo espectacular en la película.
Bea que es de aquí de San Miguel de Allende, ¿no?
Bea es una francesa que vive en San Miguel de Allende, yo creo que ya va para, no sé, 14, 15 años. Creo que cuando hicimos la película llevaba 12 años. Y pues bueno, yo la descubrí por un proceso de casting que hicimos a la productora Angélica y yo, donde una de las cosas que yo tenía como muy claras era que yo quería que la película fuera bilingüe y que el personaje no fuera hispanohablante, o sea, que su lengua materna no fuera el español, pero que hablara español. ¿Por qué? Porque mi mamá era canadiense y la cuestión del lenguaje y la pérdida del lenguaje y cómo el lenguaje se iba transformando me interesaba muchísimo. O sea, esta cuestión de que mi mamá hablaba, o sea, era angloparlante, hablaba español, pero poco a poco se fue olvidando completamente del español. Y luego, pues también del inglés, ¿no? Pero quería como explorar este juego con el lenguaje y los idiomas que yo hablo, aparte del español, son en inglés y también el francés. Entonces estábamos buscando una extranjera angloparlante o francoparlante que hablara español y que viviera en México. Entonces, pues hicimos un llamado y, bueno, Bea me contestó en un correo y desde que leí el mail sabía que era, o sea, que Bea era Lena. O O sea, sí, toda la personalidad que uno siente en la pantalla se sintió en ese primer correo y me enamoré y dije, no, pues va, la fui a ver a San Miguel de Allende, platicamos una tarde y ya sabíamos tanto ella como yo que queríamos trabajar juntas.
Bueno, como estamos hablando de ello, vamos a cambiar de idioma.
Let's go
Okay.
off into English. No, I'd be very interested to hear how you developed the script and how it was written. And was everything in the film actually scripted? There seemed to be little bits and pieces that may have been improvised. I'm thinking, I mean, there's one scene in particular that I saw this morning where she's eating the peanut butter and she begins to choke on it. And it just seemed, and then they had to go get her water, I believe, but it just seemed awfully realistic. To maybe she actually did choke on that peanut butter when she was eating it, and it was just kind of developed into the scene.
Well,
So
I'm glad it seemed very real because that scene was actually scripted.
Oh yeah.
A lot of the scenes. Well, to answer your question, how did the script evolve? As I mentioned before, the script was born from a very deep fear that I had. At one point, I was convinced I was getting Alzheimer's, and I was so terrified that I was just like stuck in my life, and I was petrified. And at one point, I thought to myself, I was like, okay, Andrea, if you have Alzheimer's, what are you going to do? And I was like, okay, let's say I have Alzheimer's, then I want to make one last film. And what will that film would be a farewell to life. I would basically say goodbye to life through a film. But then I started to think about it and I was like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. And I would make this beautiful poetic piece, but there would come a moment when I wouldn't be able to finish making the film because I have Alzheimer's and I wouldn't know how. I wouldn't know how to use the camera. I wouldn't know that I was making a movie. And eventually I wouldn't even know that I was Andrea. And so through that process of thinking, I was like, okay, well, then why don't I make it into a fiction? Fortunately, I didn't have to make that documentary because knock on wood, but I did not have Alzheimer's. So it turned into a fiction film. So then I imagined this woman who wants to make a fiction film, say as a celebratory way of saying goodbye to life. And she would have to have the aid of a documentary filmmaker to help her. So I was thinking, what kind of woman, what kind of filmmaker would she look for? Well, probably a woman. Somebody who has the same kind of sensibility and who understands that she doesn't want to make a morbid film about Alzheimer's and about the terrible illness, but rather in the context of a terrible illness, how can you continue to celebrate life? So I kind of realized then at that point that I was projecting myself into both roles, into the role of the woman who has Alzheimer's and into the role of the woman, the filmmaker who helps the woman with Alzheimer's make her film. So then that's when I decided that I was going to act in the film. And then what I did was I had the basic storyline. I knew that she was a very strong, independent, successful writer. There were certain parts of her personality and past that I knew. Her husband was no longer alive. She has children. Her children don't live necessarily in Mexico. But once I met Bea, basically, we didn't really rehearse a lot. But what we did is that we had conversations. And we were just kind of exploring the character. And as we explored the character, many of the situations that came out came from Bea. So, for example, the whole part of the musician that played that her friend is actually because she invited me to this restaurant and the musician friend was playing at the restaurant where we ended up shooting by the lake. And so Mauricio, she introduced me to Mauricio and I was like, oh, what if she has a friend who's a musician? So that whole line of the friend came from Bea's life. The kimono scene where she's got like this robe on. She told me, oh, the one time I went to Japan and I got this kimono. And so I was like, oh, it would be really cool if she just started to dance wearing socks and this kimono. So a lot of the things came about and I scripted them. But then what happened was that once we were actually shooting the film, many of the dialogues and many of most of the situations are scripted, but the actual dialogue that would happen was improvised. So it wasn't word for word. It wasn't like Bea was learning all of the dialogue. It was more like, this is the situation. This is what's going through her mind. This is what Lena is going through at this moment. But then we just kind of let it go. So there was a lot of preparation, me as a director, Bea as an actress. But once we were prepared, like that's the way I love directing is you have so much prep in the beginning, but you've prepared so well that when you're on set, it's just, you let it go and you see what happens. So really, it was a wonderful collaboration with Bea, where so many of the subtleties, so many of the nuances of the character come from Bea. Another example is that she's an artist. So Bea actually does artwork. She paints, she does collage, she's got tons of artwork all over her house. So I decided that the character of Lena, the husband who is no longer alive, I made him a painter. He originally wasn't a painter, but I was like, we've got so much artwork here, and she would sign it Aronson. So I was like, okay, well then his name is Henrik Aronson, and that's why he signs Aronson. So then all of the artwork that is Bea's is actually in the movie, but it's as if it was the husband's artwork.
Right.
So there were just so many things that it was just like a searching of, it's like a puzzle where you put all these pieces together between what's reality, what's fiction, what's a kind of mixture of both, and you end up coming up with the story.
So with all of that, how long did you actually shoot? How long was the shoot?
We shot 5 weeks, 5.5 weeks, I think. And we also shot, the set itself was also, sometimes there are such wonderful coincidences, like just gifts that appear and happen when you're making a film. And one of them is that this is a very, very, very low budget film. We had no money basically to shoot this film. So a lot of, all of the artwork and the wardrobe and all of those things we knew we weren't going to buy it or rent it or, do things like that. So I had decided that we would shoot in my parents' house. My parents were no longer alive. And, well, no, actually my mother was, but she was in a nursing home at the time. So they have this beautiful colonial house in Jutepec, Morelos. So, because we didn't have money, not only because we didn't have the money, but also because it's a very beautiful house and it feels very lived in and there has a lot of personality. So I had decided that we would be shooting in Quebec. But when I spoke to Bea, she was like, Andrea, I want you to see my studio. I'm willing to go to Quebec and stay there, but why don't you take a look at my studio and see what you think? So I go to her studio and I was like, oh my God, it's so beautiful. Like it was so perfect. We ended up doing a lot of modifications to it, including the garden, where Henrik's garden was. It was like there was nothing growing in that garden. And so we started from scratch and made that beautiful garden. And between Bea's things and my things and personal objects and Angelica and the rest of the crew, it's like we kind of created a set that was based in her space, but was actually Lena's house and studio.
Okay.
So yeah, with the 5-week shoots, we shot mostly in chronological order as well, because for several reasons, including just for acting and for the intimacy of it. It was important for me for it to be progressive as Lena gets progressively worse in her mental and physical states. I didn't want to be jumping back and forth, which is the normal way when you shoot films, is that you're just kind of, mixing up all the scenes and shooting in out of order. But here we shot mostly in order for 5.5 weeks in San Miguel de Allende. There was just there was like a 1-day shoot or a 2-day shoot in Mexico City, which was a Super 8 footage of when Henrik and Lena were younger, but the rest was in San Miguel de Allende.
Okay. What strikes me as particularly unique about this, or a lot of things that are unique, but we're watching the Alzheimer's progress from the point of view of the person suffering from it, I think. And other films I've seen have been focusing more on how the family is dealing with it, how people are reacting with it and taking care of the person. How much research did you put into making sure that the progression of Alzheimer's was realistic and how it really progresses?
I think research comes in many forms. And part of the research for this was mostly like lived research. It's what I lived with my mom.
Right.
As I mentioned, I was very, very close to the entire process of this entire stage where she would just, I'm lacking the word, but she was, anyway, she was getting worse and worse and worse, my mom. So it was very much based on my own experience. And then for certain things, for example, I did want the brain scan to be an authentic brain scan of somebody that has Alzheimer's, and that a doctor, Angelica, the producer, got the brain scan, and the doctor explained to me what it was that we were looking at and things like that, which, I had no idea. I had never looked at. My mom probably had, but I didn't remember. So there were certain things that I did do. And I didn't worry too much also. Ultimately for me, even documentaries, even if this were a documentary, it's not so much about the facts and the information, it's about the story being told and the emotions portrayed. So if somebody were to analyze how much time has actually passed, we never actually really stated how much time has passed. Somebody could interpret it as a year, somebody could interpret it as 5 years, you don't really know. But what you can feel is it's getting progressively worse.
Right.
So all of that, it was mostly based on my experience.
Okay. It's not an easy film to watch at times. And when I got to the last 5 to 10 minutes, I thought maybe I should just turn this off. I watched my mother not go through Alzheimer's, but dementia, and there were certain parallels and certain things that the character does that I saw my mother do, especially this anger that comes out of nowhere. And
Yeah.
Last time I spoke with my mother, did she rip me to pieces.
Oh, yeah.
And I couldn't quite figure out why, and there was no why, I guess. But given that, so many people have experienced watching a loved one kind of turn into someone else and then eventually become just a shadow of their former self. Just wondering, who do you want to reach with this film? I realize it's a personal expression and it's a depiction of something that you went through that was very powerful and something you're never going to forget. But who do you think your audience is for this film? Or did you even think about it?
First of all, I wanted to make a parenthesis that the anger, that also was something that really kind of shocked and like left a mark in my brain.
Yeah.
Was seeing how my mother was like the sweetest person. She never cussed. She never used swear words. And like the language that would come out of my mother's mouth, I was like, oh my God. And with Lena, that's what we played with also. She suddenly like started blurting out these swear words. And I do realize that it is very difficult to watch. I hope you did watch it till the end.
No, I did, of course.
Because I think the payoff at the end is precisely that in spite of all that pain, in spite of all that, all the sadness and the loss, there's still a reason to celebrate. And that's what Lena tells us at the end. And that's what I think the film is saying at the end, is that within this terrible, terrible circumstance that I lived, that you lived, that so many people live, how can we continue to accept those things and accept as part of life and celebrate life? So for me, in a sense, it's for all the people that are suffering or have suffered, or even, we don't know if they don't know if they will suffer. Loss in general. I mean, life is full of loss, no matter what. It could be in the form of somebody with dementia. It could be by losing a loved one. It could be by simply separating from someone. I mean, our lives are all full of loss, and our lives are full of pain, and our lives are full of sadness. So I think, at least for me, the important thing is, how do you accept that as part of life and still consider life beautiful? Because, and Lena says it. Lena's like, beauty does contain sadness. Beauty does contain pain. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, it's always it's kind of a difficult question to answer, because I'm one as a filmmaker always wants to reach the widest audiences as possible. But actually, I would just like to say a parenthesis. When we showed the film in Los Cabos, which was the world premiere, it was in the theater. There was a group of high school students de la prepa. And clearly their teacher made them go to the film festival. Like they had to go for a grade, I'm sure. Here are these like 16, 17-year-olds. And in the Q&A afterwards, they had so many questions. They were so moved. They were like, afterwards, they asked Bea for an autograph. They asked me for an autograph. When we had the red carpet a day later, one of them went and brought her grandmother so her grandmother could meet us. They were so moved, and they were 16 and 17 years old. And that's was aimed at a larger, more mature audience. And yeah, because of the subject matter, it could be for a more mature audience. But at the same time, here were these kids that were moved by it. So I think ultimately, like, that to me was so gratifying. It was like so wonderful, because I was like, they experienced loss too. They experienced pain. They could have a grandfather or a grandmother or somebody who's going through it. So I also don't like to underestimate the audience and think that, it's only for one very particular niche. Obviously, it is a difficult film in that many people on the get-go will not go to see it because of the subject matter. That I understand. And also, curiously enough, the form that I chose to tell the story in as a documentary has also kind of closed certain doors, because people just, like, oh, it's a documentary about Alzheimer's, I don't want to see it. So they don't even discover that it's not a documentary, it's a fiction film. But it's part of the risk that once, like, for me, it's important to listen to my voice and to make a decision, and I go with it as far as it will take me. And, I'm married to that decision. So here the decision was to shoot it as if it were a documentary. And I mean, at least in the places where it has shown, there are always people that reach out to me. There was like somebody in India who wrote to me were saying that they were profoundly moved by the film. So that to me is, you know, that's my audience, is whoever wants to be moved by a film like this.
Of course. Okay, well, I think you were successful then in doing that. Okay, we're switching back to Spanish.
Sí, creo que también podemos, sí te creemos, o sea, como podemos sentir la energía de... Y además creo que hasta ganaron el premio de la audiencia ahí, ¿no?
Sí,
varios
ganamos el premio del público, sí.
que eso siempre es una buena señal.
Sí,
entonces,
sí.
les invitamos, les hacemos una atenta invitación aquí en San Miguel, lo vamos a presentar el 21 de febrero. Además va a venir Andrea, entonces van a poder platicar con ella. Yo tengo una última pregunta que no tiene nada que ver con la película, porque ya nos platicaste y ya sabía que tienes otra película, yo creo que ya filmada, en la que, bueno, si nos puedes contar un poquito, porque creo que no solo tiene un poco las mismas temáticas, pero también sigues con tu estilo de hacer cine como muy libremente, y por otro lado trabajando con grandes actores, bueno, con Tenoch Huerta, que yo lo vi porque estaba involucrado mucho en el proceso de, yo creo que tuvieron un Kickstarter o algo así.
Ah, sí,
bueno, sí. Bueno, cuéntanos
Bueno,
algo, ¿cuándo lo podemos ver?
Se llama Tare, y digo, no tiene nada que ver temáticamente, pero sí tiene que ver como en el fondo, y estas como temáticas muy íntimas. Y bueno, curiosamente está muy ligado con observar las aves. Ustedes, bueno, cuando vean la película, el personaje de Henrik, el marido difunto de Bea, fue interpretado por mi pareja, Jerry, que no actuaba, no era actor profesional, o sea, él simplemente, yo lo obligué casi. Le dije, lo único que tienes que hacer es mirar a la cámara enamorado, con ojos de enamorado. Y como estás enamorado de mí, no vas a tener ningún problema. Y lo hizo increíblemente bien. O sea, el personaje de Henrik a mí me encanta, te la crees que está enamorado de Elena. Y bueno, estoy como muy feliz de que la hizo. Dos años, no, un año después de filmar la película, Jerry falleció. Repentinamente, fue algo muy inesperado. Y estábamos en un momento, bueno, o sea, en un momento de la relación, bueno, en mi vida voy a sentir un dolor tan profundo, pero como suelo hacer, o sea, ese dolor que yo estaba sintiendo en ese momento, esa pérdida y esa tristeza la volqué en una historia. Y la historia se trata de una mujer que sufre una pérdida, la pérdida de la persona, ¿no? El amor de su vida. Es una película de ficción, pero está completamente basado en lo que a mí me pasó. Y por lo mismo decidí actuar en la película. Un poco, o sea, de una manera similar a observar las aves. O sea, no era porque yo quisiera ser actriz, no era una necesidad propia mía de interpretar a la mujer en esta película. Entonces, le platiqué la idea a Tenoch, le encantó y empezamos a trabajar un guión juntos. Y él desde un principio me dijo, no, pues yo creo que sí lo puedes hacer, y me ayudó y me hizo fue como mi coach ahí de la actuación. Y la filmamos, hicimos una campaña de Kickstarter, como bien dices, y pudimos financiar el rodaje. Ha sido un poco como lento el proceso de postproducción porque no teníamos el dinero para acabar la película. Entonces, de alguna manera, pues fue filmar la película con lo que se tenía y luego ya seguir buscando los fondos para terminarla. Pero bueno, ya estamos en esas. Entonces, yo espero que la película salga ya, espero que en este año. Pero es una película también muy ganar después de una pérdida. Y bueno, estoy como muy emocionada con esa película y espero que también se presente eventualmente en San Miguel de Allende.
Sí, nos vamos a asegurar de ello, pero bueno, no quería adelantarme porque antes que nada vamos a ver esa conjuntamente el 21 de febrero aquí en el compartimento cinematográfico y vamos a poder seguir platicando con Andrea. Muchas gracias por tomarte el tiempo y bueno, muchas gracias por venir, por filmar algo en San Miguel. También obviamente estamos muy emocionados con ello.
Muchísimas gracias por la invitación.
Okay, thank you. It's nice meeting you.
Very nice to meet you.
Gracias.